Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're continuing our World War II battles series with a discussion of Operation Vengeance, the Allied assassination attempt of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Before we get into that, the museum is going to close on Labor Day. We did not raise enough money while open during the busy season to manage to remain open during the slow season over winter. So from Labor Day, probably through 6 months into next spring, the museum will be closed and all staff will be furloughed. What does that mean for the YouTube channel? It means we're going to continue to put out content until Labor Day, and then we likely won't be able to until we're brought back. What can you do to help? We have launched a Gofundme campaign, which is looking to raise $20,000. If we can raise $20,000, then we can continue to make these videos every day through the next 6 months. If you like what we're doing and would like to support the museum and our channel and our other education programs, which could also be funded by that money, please check the description below for the link to our campaign and consider supporting us. I really appreciate all the support you guys have given us so far. And with your help, I think we can continue to do this. So, Operation Vengeance is another instance of successful Allied intelligence gathering, training and preparation, and execution, and a failure of Japanese operations. The Americans have on and off broken the Japanese naval codes throughout the war so far. First, they had broken JN-24, and then they broke the slightly more sophisticated JN-25, which was the subsequent Japanese naval code. And this allowed them to position forces accurately for the Battle of Midway. And the Japanese continued to use this code even almost a year later in April of 1943. So the Allies are able to read an entire itinerary that says that Japanese Combined Fleet leader Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who planned and gave the order to execute the attack on Pearl Harbor, is going to be launching an inspection of forward air bases around the Solomon Islands. Now, the Allies have several air bases in the Solomon Islands themselves and have aircraft within easy range of these air bases. So the decision is made to try to assassinate Admiral Yamamoto. So there is still some debate on where the order to do that comes from. Some people say that President Roosevelt himself gave authorization to Secretary of the Navy Knox. There's no proof of this. If it happened, it was probably a private conversation between the two men. What we do know is that Knox gave Nimitz the discretion to target his counterpart or not. And Nimitz consulted with Admiral Halsey, who was in command of naval forces in the Southwest Pacific. And Halsey, as many of you know from watching our other videos, is extremely aggressive. And so the two admirals decided they were going to launch the attack. Now, whether this is because the president specifically said, you're going to do this, or because they had a discussion and decided that this would be a good thing for morale and to handicap the Japanese, it's unclear. So they look at their assets and they find out that the best place to ambush Yamamoto is about 400 miles away from their nearest airfield. But if their aircraft go straight to that point, 400 miles, they're going to fly over Japanese bases, and the Japanese will know that they're coming. So they have to fly out 600 miles over open water to come in and make the intercept, which means they have to execute this flawlessly because they've only got one type of aircraft that can make that intercept and engage Japanese airplanes with a chance of success. And that is the P38g Lightning. The Lightning could carry drop tanks, which extended its range. So if they did the math perfectly, they could fly out those 600 miles, drop their drop tanks, engage the Japanese escorts, and then fly 400 miles home. Now, if their timing is off and they have to search for the Japanese, if something goes wrong, say the Japanese are not on time, if they spend too long in the engagement and burn too much fuel, the aircraft can't get home. They are absolutely at the extreme end of their operational range. 18 aircraft from the 339th Fighter Squadron, are selected for the mission under the command of a Major Mitchell. And Mitchell plans the operation himself. He gets a Navy compass installed in his aircraft the day before the flight so that he's got a better navigation system for flying over open ocean. And he and his squadron train and prepare and modify their aircraft for this mission. On the Japanese side of things, why is Yamamoto doing this? So hopefully you watched last week's video on Operation Igo and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where we talk a lot about the differences between Japanese and American planning for these sorts of missions. This is very much an extension of that. The American planning is at the same level as their planning for the Bismarck Sea. And the Japanese, Admiral Yamamoto, is flying into the area to inspect and to congratulate his aircrew for their success during Operation Igo. And he called off that raid about 2 days prior to his death because he received reports from his men that said that they had absolutely crippled Allied naval and air forces in the southern Solomon Islands, preventing more American supplies from reaching the area. So he's going forward, he believes them, and he's going forward to congratulate them. The Allied airfields are not disabled. The Allied pilots are not exhausted. Yamamoto and his staff are going to be flying in 2 Betty bombers, which are being used as transports. Yamamoto and part of his staff will be in 1, and his chief of staff, his second in charge, and the rest of the staff will be in the other. This way, the whole staff isn't lost if one plane or the other is taken out, and in theory, either one of those men, Yamamoto or his chief of staff, can continue to direct operations. Because they are operating behind the lines inside Japanese airspace, only 6 A6M20s are going to be used to escort Yamamoto. So, the Americans launch their raid, they take off, and they actually arrive at the intercept point that they have planned a minute early. That is incredible preparation and execution for a raid. Something that if you're off by a couple of minutes, you just won't have the fuel to execute your mission. 2 aircraft of the 18 Americans were not able to continue the raid. One got a flat tire on takeoff, and another one, the fuel tanks were installed, but the aircraft was not able to draw fuel from the tank, so it would not have the range and had to return. So now 16 American aircraft are in the area. These aircraft are set up into 2 groups. basically. There are 4 that are assigned to go in and kill the Japanese bombers. The other 14 were going to be used as basically a combat air patrol. They were going to be flying higher up to protect against other Japanese fighters, whether it was the escorts in the mission or Japanese fighters at nearby airfields that could scramble and come out and help. 2 of those fighters were backup planes that would join the kill force if needed. Now, as Murphy's Law would have it, the 2 aircraft that had diverted were supposed to be part of the kill force. So they went from 4 in the kill force to only 2. So those 2 reserve planes join the kill force, and that leaves 12 fighters flying combat air patrol. The Americans are able to plan this like this because their intelligence was so good. They have the exact number of aircraft the Japanese are going to be using and their locations. They have the exact itinerary of when Yamamoto's leaving here, when he's expected to arrive there, etc. And Admiral Yamamoto is incredibly punctual. So the Americans arrive, and they conduct this entire flight at wave-top height, which is not nearly as fuel efficient as high up, but it makes them impossible to be, or more difficult to be detected by radar or observers. And they do it in radio silence, so that Japanese listening posts can't hear them talk. So the 16 aircraft flying at wave-top height without talking to each other all managed to make it to the area and then go to their assigned areas. And sure enough, they get there, and as soon as they get there, Yamamoto's flight descends below the cloud cover on their landing approach. They're about 10 minutes out from their destination. Absolutely flawless execution of the plan so far. I cannot overstate how difficult it is to do this. So the American fighters of the kill force are still at wave-top height. They see the Japanese and they drop their tanks and turn to go and attack them. So basically, as the Japanese are coming out of the clouds on a landing approach, the Americans at wave-top height are coming in to intercept. Climbing at combat speed burns a ton of fuel and leaves them incredibly vulnerable to the Japanese fighters, which have a height advantage. And altitude can be traded for speed, and speed is the most important asset a fighter pilot has at his disposal. But this is how they planned it. Unfortunately, one of the 3 aircraft in the kill squadron had a drop tank issue. The drop tanks didn't deploy when he pushed the button. So he and his wingman stay at wave-type height instead of engaging. So now only 2 American aircrafts are coming up against 8 Japanese aircraft. And as the fighters dive on them, they do exactly what they're supposed to, and they put their nose towards the enemy. So that gives a relatively small profile, keeps them within your own field of view as the pilot, and allows you to fire at them to get them to be less accurate when they're trying to line up their shot on you. And so both American planes are able to make it out, make it through the Japanese fighter cover. These 6 Japanese fighters are now doing their dive. They can't pull up and go back. They're going too fast. But there are 2 fighters ahead of them at wave-type height. At this point, the pilot whose drop tanks had jammed manages to release them, and they're able to turn and dogfight. One of these 2 pilots never makes it home. Nobody sees what happens to them. Odds are that the Japanese fighters were able to down him over the ocean. The Japanese didn't claim any kills at the time of the attack, but later on, one of the pilots said that he thought he got a kill. If the plane wasn't damaged or destroyed in combat here, it didn't have the fuel to make it home and was lost somewhere over the open ocean. So the 2 aircraft that have made it through the fighter screen now have to line up on the Japanese bombers. the bombers are pretty slow moving, and they're on landing approach, so they can't maneuver too well. And so these American fighters are able to get behind them and shoot down first one bomber. And it turns out the first bomber, the Americans didn't know which one was which, but the first bomber had Admiral Yamamoto in it. So they managed to shoot it down, and the aircraft lands in the jungle. The other aircraft maneuvers out of the way, and the fighters are able to track that down and shoot it down over the open ocean. So that second aircraft is never recovered. And it's unclear which pilots got the kill, because at least 2 pilots were attacking each of these aircraft. And it was unclear which pilots killed Yamamoto, because it wasn't clear which aircraft he was in, to the Americans at least. So eventually, 2 pilots, Lanphier and Barber, claim that they killed Yamamoto. Lanphier makes the claim immediately, and he makes it loudly, and he publishes a lot of stuff, and he gets into newspapers, and is for many years recorded as being the person who killed Yamamoto. Barber waits until he's older and then decides, hey, this isn't fair, and puts out there that he contributed significantly. And, there's still some controversy over who did it. Major Mitchell, who planned the raid, had been up for the Medal of Honor until the newspapers released that Lanphier had done the actual kill. And so Mitchell, even though he had planned this hugely successful raid, so he is downgraded from the Medal of Honor to the Navy Cross, which is awarded to all 16 pilots that made the flight. So the Japanese, upon learning that this had happened, they sent out a search and rescue party to find the aircraft that was shot down in the jungle. And they're able to find it a day later. The intercept takes place on April 18th, 2 days after Operation Igo ended. April 18th, 1943. The search party finds the downed aircraft on the 19th. That turns out to be the aircraft that had Yamamoto in it, and his body is found still sitting in his chair, but the chair had been thrown free of the aircraft when it crashed and was propped up against a nearby tree. 3 bullets were found to have gotten Yamamoto. 50 caliber rounds had punched through his back, his shoulder, and his jaw and head. And so he had been killed before the aircraft had crashed. It's said that his body was recovered in good condition and was entirely recognizable, and that he had his gloved hand. He had lost 2 fingers during the Battle of Tsushima at the beginning of his naval career, and so he always wore a white glove. It was said that his gloved hand was still clutching his sword when he was recovered. So this raid was a huge success for the Allies. It was a huge morale boost for them, and a huge shot to morale to the Japanese. Yamamoto had an incredible mind for training and operations and planning, and he was able to coordinate vast bodies of ships. And as a gambler, he was willing to take risks, which subsequent Japanese admirals tried to preserve their forces and did not take similar risks to Yamamoto. His legacy is a conflicted one. His operations tended to be overblown and involved dispersing his units over wide areas and consuming a lot of resources. This is known in hindsight and was a major issue because the Allies were reading all of his plans, which were supposed to be secret, and therefore knew what his deployments were ahead of time. And had we not been reading all the Japanese naval codes, maybe his deployments would have worked out more effectively. Whatever the case, Yamamoto had been a major architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and had directed the training and execution of that operation. It was called Operation Vengeance for a reason. Thank you guys for watching today. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you get more content. Feel free to leave a comment down in the comment section and let us know if you have questions or know anything else about the raid that I didn't mention today. And if you would like to support the museum and our YouTube channel so that we can continue to operate after Labor Day, please consider clicking the link in the description below to go to our GoFundMe page and help fund our next 6 months of operations. Thank you for your continued support.